In a packed courtroom where justice was supposed to reign, one racist officer pushed too far, humiliating an innocent man in front of everyone. But what she didn't know was that someone powerful was watching, someone who wouldn't let injustice go unanswered. Stay with us until the end, because when Jason Statham stands up, the entire courtroom and her career are about to change forever. The Dallas County Courthouse pulsed with its usual morning rhythm, a tide of suits, briefcases, and whispered arguments drifting through its marble halls. But that fragile normalcy shattered when Officer Karen Briggs stormed through the doors of Courtroom 4B. The heavy click of her boots against the polished floor struck like gunshots in the still air. In her grip, a young black man stumbled forward, his wrists bound tightly in cold metal. Briggs's uniform was immaculate, but her eyes burned with a rigid fury born not of duty, but of something deeper and uglier. 15 years on the force had hardened her instincts into something sharper, something suspicious of every face that didn't mirror her own. And today her target had been Marcus Reed. No crime proven, no charges clear, just a morning patrol that spiraled into violence because her gut told her he didn't belong. The gallery shifted uneasily as she dragged him forward. Judges, clerks, attorneys. They'd seen countless arraignments, but something about this one felt off. As Marcus was pushed through the aisle, heads turned, conversations faltered, and a thick current of discomfort coiled through the room. Near the back, a man sat with his arms resting loosely on his knees, his head slightly lowered beneath the brim of a worn cap. Jeans, boots, a simple gray t-shirt. The kind of man no one would notice. But his stillness was deceptive. Beneath the casual posture was a pressure, a tightly wound calm, like the quiet before a storm. His fingers flexed once against his knees, absorbing the rising tension as if measuring it. The judge presiding that morning, an aging man with weary eyes, hesitated longer than usual as Officer Briggs barked out her accusations. Resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, phrases too easily thrown against the defenseless. Her voice, sharp and self-assured, echoed off the high ceilings. Marcus Reed said nothing. He stood tall despite the bruises darkening his cheek, the dignity in his stance throwing Briggs's aggression into even starker relief. But his silence only seemed to fuel her contempt, her grip tightening on his arm as if punishing him for daring to remain proud. Across the courtroom whispers rippled, murmured outrage, furtive glances at the man in the cap. Something unsaid floated in the air, an unformed question, a tension on the verge of snapping. The judge cleared his throat, summoning an air of authority he didn't quite feel, and motioned for Marcus to be brought to the defendant's table. Briggs yanked him forward without subtlety, her eyes daring anyone to challenge her methods. And that was when the man at the back moved. He rose slowly, purposefully, and every eye in the courtroom seemed drawn to him at once. There was nothing overtly threatening in his posture. No sudden motions, no raised voice, just a simple act, standing, that shifted the very weight of the room. Briggs noticed him too, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Authority didn't like to be questioned, and Karen Briggs was a woman who saw questions as threats. Her hand instinctively hovered near her belt, fingers grazing the holster not out of necessity but out of reflex, one learned from years of mistaking fear for danger. The man walked forward, unhurried but unstoppable, each step peeling layers of false security from the room. The marble tiles seemed to echo louder beneath his boots than they had under anyone else's, and though he said nothing, his presence was a demand louder than any words. Briggs squared her shoulders as he approached, masking the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her face. She barked an order, sharp, dismissive, intended to halt him in his tracks. But the man did not slow. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze, the ancient reflex of a society taught to expect the worst. Phones tilted in hands, eyes widened, breath hitched collectively in a single, fragile moment. What he pulled out was not a weapon but a wallet, simple, worn, and from it, a document gleamed briefly under the harsh fluorescent lights. A badge, but not one bound to a city precinct. Not a local authority, something higher, something untouchable. The judge leaned forward, his face draining of color as recognition dawned. Officer Briggs took a single step back, confusion knitting her brows as she strained to see. But the man didn't present the badge to her. He offered it only to the bench, his gaze never once acknowledging Briggs's existence. At that moment, the courthouse gallery was no longer murmuring. It was silent, utterly, reverently silent. And then as he slid the wallet shut and tucked it away, the man slowly lifted his chin, letting the cap's shadow fall away from his face. For a heartbeat, the room forgot how to breathe. There, standing casually under the cruel brightness of courtroom lights, was Jason Statham. The same man whose face had graced action movies, whose name carried the weight of quiet strength and unswerving justice, here not as a celebrity, not as an actor, but as something far more dangerous to injustice, a witness, a reckoning. Officer Briggs blinked, as if her mind couldn't reconcile what her eyes were seeing. But there would be no time for second guesses, no time to rewrite the moment she realized she hadn't just targeted any man. She had laid her hands on Jason Statham himself. The judge's gavel hovered motionless in the air as Jason took another step forward, and with a voice that seemed to cut through the very bones of the courtroom, he spoke at last. The weight of Jason's voice rolled across the courtroom like a silent explosion, unseen yet impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The very tone of it carried authority, not from a badge or a gun, but from a life lived standing against injustice. Officer Briggs stiffened as if the ground itself had betrayed her. Every fiber of her being screamed to reassert control, to bark an order, to pull rank. But something primal, something deeper than training, warned her against it. She had mistaken compliance for fear her entire career, but now she stood before a man who owed her nothing and feared her even less. Jason moved closer to the bench, never sparing a glance at the officer still frozen beside Marcus Reed. The young man stood straighter now, sensing the shift even if he didn't fully understand it yet. His dignity, battered but unbroken, finally found an anchor. The judge leaned forward, the gavel still trembling in his hand, his old instincts warring with the new reality unraveling before him. Authority was being rewritten right there in the hallowed halls of the law. Without asking permission, Jason placed a sealed envelope on the judge's desk. A dossier, thick and heavy, stamped with federal insignia. It was more than paperwork. It was a reckoning. A ledger of abuses, misconducts, and overlooked complaints, all tied together by one name: Karen Briggs. The gallery gasped as the judge's hands trembled, flipping through the contents page after damning page. Each document peeled away another layer of the carefully maintained image Briggs had built over the years. Each testimony, each photograph, each ignored body cam footage was a brick pulled from the crumbling wall of her false authority. Jason remained silent, letting the evidence speak for itself. His mere presence enforced an unspoken verdict long before any legal pronouncement could be made. The judge's voice, when it finally returned, was thin and hollow compared to the authority that Jason exuded without effort. A motion was passed, swift, almost mechanical, to suspend the current proceedings. The charges against Marcus Reed were dropped in an instant, erased like chalk beneath a hard rain. But it wasn't enough. Jason's steady gaze never left Officer Briggs. He wasn't here just to correct one injustice. He was here to dismantle a sickness that had been allowed to thrive in silence. Briggs, who had once swaggered into courtrooms confident that her badge would shield her from consequences, now stood naked beneath the judgment of her peers, and worse, beneath the weight of her own actions. The bailiffs exchanged uncertain glances. Not at Jason, not at Marcus, at Briggs. The shift was complete. Power had moved, and she no longer held it. From the corner of his eye, Jason caught a flash of movement. A reporter from the Dallas Morning News hastily scribbling notes, capturing every detail, every glance, every crack in the armor of a woman who had believed herself untouchable. The gallery, silent moments ago, now buzzed with quiet urgency, the ripple of a story too explosive to stay contained. And still, Jason waited. The judge closed the folder with a soft, almost reverent motion and set it aside like a sacred relic. Marcus Reed was released from his cuffs, the metallic click of the shackles falling away like a door slamming shut on a past he was finally free to leave behind. But Jason made no move to leave. Not yet. He had peeled away the mask, but there was still one truth left to reveal. Because Briggs wasn't just guilty of misconduct, she wasn't just guilty of discrimination, she was guilty of forgetting why she had ever sworn an oath at all. Jason took another step forward, the silence stretching painfully tight. His presence alone demanded an answer Briggs couldn't give. She had built her career on fear, and now she was crumbling beneath the weight of her own creation. Every eye in the room locked onto her. The world outside the courthouse no longer existed. There was only the sterile air, the fading echoes of injustice, and the slow, steady fall of a woman from her own imagined throne. And then Jason did something no one expected. He reached once more into the inside pocket of his jacket, not for a weapon, not for more evidence, but for something even more devastating. A second badge. This one even heavier with meaning. A federal badge, yes, but tied to a task force dedicated to civil rights violations special division. Jason Statham was not just a celebrity. He was an agent of accountability. And Karen Briggs had just attacked a man sent to clean up the very rot she had helped to fester. The judge stood slowly, his hand flattening against the bench as he uttered the words that would shatter Officer Briggs's world forever. Officer Briggs, you are hereby ordered to surrender your badge. The silence that followed the judge's command was not empty. It throbbed, heavy and suffocating, pressing against every wall of the courtroom until the very air seemed to vibrate with it. Officer Karen Briggs didn't move. She stood frozen, her hand brushing the badge pinned to her chest, as if by clutching it she could somehow cling to the crumbling authority it once represented. But the badge no longer protected her. It had become an indictment of everything she had twisted it to mean. The bailiffs hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. Briggs's breathing quickened, the flush of rage and humiliation creeping up her neck, staining her cheeks red. Her instincts screamed to fight, to argue, to lash out. But Jason's steady presence held her in place more effectively than any pair of handcuffs. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't raised his hand. He didn't need to. His very existence in that courtroom, calm and immovable, was enough to unearth every sin she'd buried beneath years of procedure and arrogance. The judge's voice, steady now, cut through the charged atmosphere. Briggs was to surrender her badge and her service weapon immediately pending a full investigation into her conduct. There would be no appeal today, no quick escape. As Briggs fumbled with the clasp of her badge, Jason watched, not with triumph but with a piercing, sorrowful gaze that weighed heavier than anger ever could. He wasn't here for vengeance, he was here for justice. And justice, he understood, was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about exposing the rot so the wounds could begin to heal. When Briggs finally placed her badge on the bench, it landed with a hollow metallic clink that echoed far longer than it should have. It was the sound of a life's work undone in an instant. Jason stepped forward once more, not toward the judge, not toward Marcus, but toward Briggs herself. The crowd tensed as if expecting an explosion, but no fists flew, no shouting match erupted. Instead, Jason spoke with a gravity that filled every empty space between the hearts beating in that room. He spoke of strength. Not the kind born from fear or dominance, but the strength that came from restraint, from humility, from understanding that true authority was not given by a badge, but earned through service. He spoke of the countless names lost to injustice, of the silent battles fought in the shadows by those who had no platform, no voice, and no one to stand for them. And he spoke directly to Briggs, his words cutting cleaner than any blade. He reminded her of the oath she had taken, the promise to protect, not to harm. He spoke of how fear corrodes judgment, how pride blinds the soul, and how unchecked authority becomes its own form of tyranny. The courtroom listened, every word hammering into their bones like nails into a forgotten foundation. Even Briggs, who had built a wall of pride around herself for so many years, stood defenseless against the quiet storm Jason unleashed. Somewhere behind him a phone buzzed, a forgotten device still clutched by a reporter too stunned to move. It was a small sound, almost comical against the gravity of the moment, but no one laughed. No one dared break the spell. The judge sat down heavily, his face drawn and weary, as if the weight of decades of silent complicity had finally settled on his shoulders. Marcus Reed, still standing to the side, watched with wide eyes, not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a young man witnessing the rarest of moments. Truth spoken without fear, power answered with righteousness. Jason turned then, slowly, deliberately, and faced the entire gallery. He told them it wasn't enough to sit in silence when injustice unfolded. It wasn't enough to look away, to excuse, to hope someone else would act. Authority, he said, belongs to those who serve, not those who rule through fear. Every person in that room carried the burden of that truth now. They could no longer plead ignorance. They had seen the mask fall. And then Jason did something no one expected. He extended a hand toward Officer Briggs, not in mockery, not in cruelty, but as a bridge, a chance, not to erase what she had done, but to offer her a first step back toward the person she should have been all along. The courtroom inhaled as one, suspended between collapse and redemption. Briggs stared at the hand, her own shaking slightly at her sides. Pride, fear, shame, all battled within her, clawing for dominance. Jason waited, unmoving, letting the choice be hers. Because real change cannot be forced. It must be chosen. And in that suspended breath, as the weight of years crashed around her, Briggs reached. But before she could touch his hand, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom, cold, angry, and full of resentment, shattering the fragile moment. "Don't you dare show weakness to him." The room snapped toward the source, and what they saw made everything even more dangerous. The shout cracked through the courtroom like a thunderclap, ripping apart the delicate stillness that had settled over the moment. Heads snapped toward the sound, and a man shoved his way forward from the gallery, older, uniformed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A superior officer, one who had clearly shaped Briggs's career, and perhaps her mindset. His face was twisted with rage, not at the injustice that had been exposed, but at the humiliation of losing control. His words, raw and desperate, clawed at Briggs, urging her back toward the old instincts, the old armor that had protected her pride at the cost of her humanity. For a heartbeat, Briggs faltered. Her hand, still inches from Jason's, trembled in the air, caught between two worlds. The one she had known, built on dominance, fear, and silent compliance, and the one now offered to her, fragile and new, built on humility, service, and redemption. Jason didn't move. He didn't flinch or withdraw the offer. His hand remained steady, a silent defiance against the roar of anger still reverberating across the room. The gallery held its breath, sensing that something far greater than a career was at stake. The older officer barked again, his voice cracking this time, not with power but with desperation. He wasn't saving her. He was trying to pull her back into his sinking ship, into the old ways that were being washed away before everyone's eyes. Briggs squeezed her eyes shut, the muscles in her jaw tightening painfully. Her world, the world she had built, defended, and believed in, was crumbling. All her justifications, all her excuses, collapsed under the simple, unbearable weight of truth. And yet, in the silence that stretched beyond the shouting, another sound rose. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the sound of Marcus Reed, standing tall, breathing steady, dignity untouched. It was the sound of the people in the gallery leaning forward, willing her to choose the harder path. It was the sound of her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears, not with fear, but with something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Remorse, and the hope, terrifying and fragile, that maybe it wasn't too late. With a breath that seemed to tear itself from her lungs, Briggs turned away from the shouting officer. She lowered her gaze, her fingers unclenching from the fists they had so often become. She looked up and placed her hand into Jason's. The older officer's curses became background noise, drowned by the surge of stunned murmurs rising from the gallery. Jason didn't squeeze her hand. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Real strength was not about who could shout the loudest. It was about who could stand the quietest in the face of temptation and choose not to fall. The judge, still seated but watching with an expression that had softened from sternness to something almost weary and sad, slowly nodded. The gallery shifted. Something invisible but undeniable had changed. Jason guided Briggs's hand down gently, releasing her, offering her not absolution but the beginning of a road she would have to walk herself. Marcus Reed stepped forward then, not out of anger, not for confrontation, but because he understood better than anyone in that room what was being asked. Forgiveness was not a gift for the forgiven. It was freedom for the one who forgave. And Briggs, standing between the two men she had once tried to crush under the weight of her badge, understood for the first time what real power looked like. It looked like humility. It looked like service. It looked like courage. Jason turned then. No announcement. No need for a grand speech. His mission was never to destroy. It was always to restore. He walked out of the courtroom in silence, the doors swinging closed behind him. But the echoes of what had happened there that day would ripple outward far beyond those marble walls. Outside, the morning sun burned through the heavy clouds that had gathered during the trial, scattering them into shards of gold across the city skyline. Justice, battered and bruised, had taken a small step forward, because one man had stood, and because one woman, at the very last moment, had chosen to rise. Somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, the real battle for change was just beginning. And for the first time, Officer Karen Briggs wasn't running from it. She was ready to fight the right way. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a fall from power. It was a reminder that real strength lies in standing for what's right. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because here we believe in justice, redemption, and stories that truly matter. Don't miss what's coming next. There's always more to uncover when you choose to see beyond appearances. Subscribe now and join us for the next incredible journey.